My name is Gordon, and if you've ever poured your life into a job only to be thrown away like a piece of trash, then you need to hear this. Let me know what you think of my story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories just like this one. You see, when I reported a critical safety failure on our assembly line, a failure that could have cost people their lives, my supervisor, Wesley, he didn't thank me. He didn't convene an emergency meeting. He pulled me into his glass-walled office, the one that looked out over the floor I had managed for 25 years, and he told me to keep it quiet. Then, exactly 1 week later, he fired me for poor performance. He really thought that would be the end of it. Another old-timer put out to pasture, another problem swept under the rug, but Wesley didn't know that I had documented everything. He didn't know I had a perfect, crystal-clear recording of his direct order to falsify federal safety logs. So I didn't just report the original violation to OSHA. I reported a deliberate criminal cover-up orchestrated by a manager who valued his bonus more than his employees' lives. OSHA isn't just sending an inspector to OmniMech. They're sending a team of federal investigators from the Office of the Inspector General, and my supervisor's direct order is Exhibit A. He thought he was burying a problem. He had no idea he was burying himself. The silence in my truck on the drive home was louder than any machine on the factory floor. It was a dense, heavy silence, the kind that presses in on you, filling your ears until you can hear your own blood pumping. I had just spent 45 minutes in a sterile, beige HR conference room. Wesley sat on one side of the table, looking uncomfortable but resolute, a little smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. On the other side was Brenda from HR, a woman I'd known for 15 years, a woman who used to bring her daughter to the company picnics. Today, she wouldn't meet my eyes. She just slid a thin manila folder across the polished table. My separation agreement. They used words like restructuring and streamlining. They talked about performance metrics and a shift in strategic focus. It was all a carefully constructed language designed to say one thing without ever actually saying it. You're old, you're expensive, and you're a problem. Wesley, with his crisp new MBA and his shoes that cost more than my first car, did most of the talking. He had this way of speaking in confident, empty paragraphs, as if reading from a business school textbook. He said my performance had been lagging, that I was resistant to the new, more agile workflows he was implementing. He said it with a straight face. This man who I had personally trained on the very basics of our plant's operations less than 2 years ago. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. Poor performance. Me. I'd started at OmniMech when I was 22 years old, fresh out of trade school. I started on the line packing boxes. I worked my way up to technician, then lead tech, then shift supervisor, and for the last 15 years I was the floor manager. The whole floor. 3 shifts, 200 employees, a multi-million-dollar operation churning out high-precision aerospace components. I didn't just manage the floor. I knew it. I knew the sound each machine made when it was running perfectly, and I knew the subtle change in pitch that signaled a bearing was about to fail. I knew the families of the people who worked for me. I knew whose kid was graduating, whose wife was sick, who was struggling to make their mortgage. For 25 years, OmniMech wasn't just a job. It was the place where I had built my life, my career, my identity. I was Gordon from OmniMech, and now, in the span of a 45-minute meeting, I was just Gordon. I pulled into my driveway and just sat there, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house was empty. My wife Sarah was at her nursing job, and the kids were grown and gone. The quiet that was a comfort just this morning now felt like an accusation. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel. They were calloused, with faint old scars from a lifetime of working with machines. These hands had fixed more problems than Wesley had ever identified on a spreadsheet. These hands had signed off on decades of safety reports, training manuals, and performance reviews for hundreds of people. And now, according to a man who still thought torque was just a brand of chewing tobacco, these hands were responsible for poor performance. The inciting incident, the one that started this whole avalanche, had happened 8 days ago. It was a Tuesday. I was doing my morning walkthrough, a ritual I never skipped. The air smelled of hot metal and coolant, the familiar perfume of my world. I was walking past line 4 where we assembled the hydraulic actuators for landing gear. It was our most critical line, the one with zero tolerance for error, and I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible hiss. It was wrong. It was the kind of sound that doesn't show up on any sensor or dashboard. It's the kind of thing you only hear when you've spent 10,000 hours on that floor. I motioned for the line operator, a young guy named Kevin, to shut it down. He looked at me, confused. The readouts were all green. Everything looked fine. I just pointed at the emergency stop. I've learned over the years that you don't argue with your gut on a factory floor. Competence isn't about reading the manual. It's about knowing when the manual is wrong. We powered down the main hydraulic press, and there it was, a hairline fracture in the primary pressure manifold. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, a tiny weeping crack under a high-pressure fitting. If we hadn't stopped, it would have held for another hour, maybe two. Then it would have failed catastrophically. We're talking about a sudden explosive release of hydraulic fluid at 3,000 psi. It would have vaporized into a fine mist, and at the temperatures we were running, it would have instantly ignited. The resulting fireball would have engulfed the entire section of the line. Kevin, his partner, and at least 3 other people would have been severely burned if not killed. We dodged a bullet, a big one. I did what I always do. I documented the failure, took photos, and quarantined the faulty part for metallurgical analysis. I wrote up a preliminary report and put a hold on all existing inventory that used manifolds from the same batch. It was standard procedure. It was my procedure, the one I had written 15 years ago. By noon, I had the report on Wesley's desk. I expected a pat on the back, a good catch, Gordon. Instead, he called me into his office. He didn't ask me to sit. He stood behind his big empty desk, fiddling with a silver pen. He looked at my report, then at me. His expression wasn't one of relief. It was one of annoyance. He said, "Do you have any idea what this means, Gordon? This batch of manifolds is from our new cost-effective supplier, the one he had personally championed. A hold on this inventory means we miss the quarterly shipment to our biggest aerospace client. It means penalties. It means his numbers. The only thing he actually cared about would look bad. I told him the alternative was putting people's lives at risk. I explained the physics of a hydraulic flash fire. I didn't raise my voice. I just stated the facts. This is what I do. I identify risks, and I mitigate them." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Look," he said, "the lab report on that manifold will take weeks. The chances of another one failing are astronomical. We can't afford to shut down production over a what-if." He pushed my report back across the desk. "I need you to amend this. Change the cause from material fatigue to improper installation by the team. Then I need you to go into the digital logbook and close out the maintenance ticket. Just sign off on it. We'll replace that one part and keep the line running. Keep it quiet, Gordon. It's better for everyone." I just stared at him. He wasn't just asking me to ignore a problem. He was asking me to falsify a safety log and blame my own crew for a catastrophic equipment failure. He was asking me to commit a federal crime to protect his quarterly numbers. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was it. This was the line. For 2 years I had watched this man undermine everything I had built. He'd cut training budgets, slashed maintenance staff, and ignored the warnings of every senior technician on the floor, all in the name of efficiency. I had fought him in meetings, argued with him over emails, and tried to shield my people from the worst of his decisions. I had done it all while being a company man. I thought my loyalty was to OmniMech, the company that had given me a career. But in that moment, I realized my loyalty was to the people on that floor and to the pilots and passengers who would one day trust their lives to the parts we made. I picked up my report from his desk. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "No, Wesley, I won't do that." I walked out of his office. I knew then my career at OmniMech was over. I just didn't know it would end so formally, a week later with Brenda from HR refusing to look at me. Sitting in my truck, the silence was finally broken by the sound of my own breathing, a slow, steady rhythm. The shock was wearing off, replaced by something else, a cold, hard clarity. Wesley thought he had won. He thought he had silenced the old man who was a thorn in his side. He thought he could just erase 25 years of service with a few buzzwords and a boilerplate termination letter. He was wrong. Because when I walked out of his office a week ago after he gave me that illegal order, I didn't go straight back to the floor. I went to my own small, cluttered office in the back. I closed the door, and I took out the small, discreet digital voice recorder I had started carrying in my shirt pocket 6 months ago. It was a habit I'd picked up after Wesley had misremembered a few of our verbal agreements in meetings with his own bosses. I pressed the save button. The file name was just the date and time, but the contents were Wesley's career in a 4-minute audio file. His voice, clear as day, instructing me to falsify a federal record and cover up a near-fatal disaster. He thought his order was just words disappearing into the air of his fancy office. He didn't know I had turned them into evidence. He didn't know I had Exhibit A, and as I finally turned the key in the ignition and backed out of my driveway, I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of his. The first 24 hours after being fired are a strange void. You exist in a state of suspended animation. The routines that have governed your life for decades are suddenly gone. There's no 5:30 a.m. alarm. There's no worn path from the bedroom to the coffee pot to the front door. There's just space, and in that space, the ghosts of your professional life come to visit. I spent most of that first day in my workshop in the garage. It's my sanctuary, a place of order and logic. The walls are lined with tools, each one clean, each one in its proper place. I was supposed to be fixing an old grandfather clock for a neighbor, a delicate mechanism of gears and weights that required patience and precision. But I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to OmniMech, replaying the last 2 years like a film reel stuck on a loop. Wesley's arrival had been heralded like the second coming. The corporate memo described him as a dynamic change agent with a fresh MBA from some prestigious East Coast school. The old plant manager, a man named Frank who had come up through the ranks just like me, was retiring. We all expected one of the senior managers, maybe me, to get the job. Instead, they brought in Wesley, a 30-something outsider who had never set foot in a manufacturing plant. His only qualification seemed to be his fluency in a language I called corporate nonsense. He talked about synergies, leveraging assets, and optimizing verticals. To him, the plant wasn't a complex ecosystem of people and machinery. It was a set of numbers on a dashboard, and his only job was to make the numbers go up. My first real clash with him came about a month after he started. He called me into his office, the same one where he would later order me to commit a crime. He had a spreadsheet projected on the big screen on his wall. It was a cost analysis of our maintenance department. He pointed to a line item. "Gordon," he said, his tone one of a patient teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "I'm seeing a significant recurring expenditure here for preventative maintenance on the CNC machines. I've cross-referenced this with industry benchmarks and we're overspending by about 30%. We need to streamline this. Let's move to a reactive maintenance model. We'll fix things when they break, it's more efficient." I tried to explain to him that these weren't toasters. They were 5-axis milling machines that cost $1 million apiece. They operated at tolerances measured in microns. Reactive maintenance on a machine like that doesn't mean replacing a worn belt. It means a catastrophic failure that could destroy a multi-$1,000 spindle, scrap a $10,000 piece of titanium, and shut down a production line for weeks. Preventative maintenance wasn't an expense. It was the cheapest insurance policy we had. I explained that the industry benchmarks he was quoting were for facilities that produced cheap consumer goods, not mission-critical aerospace components. He just smiled that infuriatingly placid smile. "I appreciate your perspective, Gordon. I really do. It's that kind of institutional knowledge that's so valuable. But we have to be forward-thinking. We have to trust the data." He overruled me. He cut the preventative maintenance budget by 1/3. And so it began. The slow, creeping decay of a once great operation. I watched as my best, most experienced maintenance techs grew frustrated. They were proud craftsmen, and they hated seeing their machines run into the ground. 2 of them, men with a combined 30 years of experience, quit within 6 months. Wesley replaced them with younger, cheaper contract workers who knew how to follow a checklist but had no intuitive feel for the equipment. Some people mistake silence for surrender. I wasn't surrendering. I was documenting. Every time a machine failed because of a predictable, preventable issue, I filed a detailed report. I noted the date of the failure, the cost of the repair, the hours of lost production, and I always ended my report with the same line: "This failure could have been prevented with the previously budgeted maintenance schedule." I had a file folder in my desk drawer that was 3 inches thick. Wesley probably never even read them, just had his assistant file them away. But I had them. Then came the new supplier for the hydraulic manifolds. It was another of Wesley's brilliant cost-saving initiatives. Our old supplier was a German company, expensive but flawless. Their quality control was legendary. Wesley found a new supplier in Southeast Asia that could provide the same parts for 40% less. I raised a red flag. I asked for the metallurgical reports, the stress testing data, the ISO certification documents. Wesley brushed me off. It's a commodity part, Gordon. Steel is steel. Don't be a dinosaur. He approved the purchase of 10,000 units. That hairline fracture on line 4 was the first rotten fruit from that tree. I put down my screwdriver and walked out of the garage. The sun was setting. I went inside and poured myself a small glass of whiskey. Sarah would be home soon, and I'd have to tell her. I dreaded it. Not because I was afraid of her reaction, she was a rock, but because saying the words out loud would make it real. It would transform it from an internal monologue of shock and anger into a hard fact of our lives. My career was over. The pension I was just 3 years away from qualifying for was gone. The sense of purpose that had gotten me out of bed every morning for my entire adult life had been extinguished. As I sat there in the fading light, my mind went back to a conversation I'd had with Frank, the old plant manager, at his retirement party. We were standing by the sad-looking sheet cake in the break room. Frank looked tired, but also relieved. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Gordon," he said, "you're the soul of this place. Don't let these new corporate guys break it. They see lines on a chart. You see the people behind the lines. Don't ever forget that's where the real value is." I had tried to honor that. I really had. I had shielded my people as much as I could. I had fought the battles I thought I could win and swallowed the ones I knew I would lose. I had compromised. I had played the game. I had told myself that staying inside, even with a fool like Wesley in charge, was better than leaving the floor completely unprotected. I see now that this was a form of debatable character logic on my part. I was loyal to a fault. Loyal to an idea of a company that no longer existed. My loyalty had become a liability. I had let things slide, small things at first, all in the name of keeping the peace and protecting my team, but the small things had accumulated, like plaque in an artery, until the whole system was on the verge of a heart attack. The incident on line 4 wasn't an anomaly, it was the inevitable conclusion of 1,000 small compromises, and Wesley's order to cover it up, that wasn't just a bad decision. It was the symptom of a profoundly sick corporate culture he had fostered. Sarah came home around 8. I saw her headlights sweep across the living room wall. I heard the garage door open and close, her familiar footsteps in the hall. She came into the kitchen and saw me sitting there in the near dark, the untouched glass of whiskey on the table. She didn't have to ask, she just knew. She put her bag down, came over and put her arms around my shoulders from behind. I leaned my head back against her. "He fired you," she said. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Poor performance." I felt her hands tighten on my shoulders. "Gordon," she said, her voice full of a fire that I suddenly realized I had been missing in myself, "you are the most competent man I have ever known. Don't you let that weasel make you doubt that for 1 second." And that was the catalyst. It wasn't the anger, or the injustice, or the fear for my own future. It was her unwavering belief in me. It was the sudden, stark realization that my professional worth wasn't defined by Wesley or OmniMech or some HR file. It was defined by my skills, my experience, and my integrity. And they hadn't fired my integrity. They had just set it free. The resignation I had been feeling all day began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. I stood up and turned on the lights. The kitchen was flooded with a bright, clean glare. I looked at Sarah. "He didn't just fire me," I said. "He tried to make me his accomplice. He ordered me to falsify a safety log to cover up a near disaster." Her eyes widened. "And?" A slow smile spread across my face. It was the first time I had smiled all day, and I recorded it. I went into my home office, a room that was a smaller, more personal version of my workshop. It was filled with books on engineering and management, framed photos of my family, and a few commendations from my early years at the company. I sat down at my desk and pulled a small silver pen from my shirt pocket. It looked like any other pen, but a subtle twist of the top revealed a tiny USB connector. I plugged it into my computer. A single audio file appeared on the screen. 2023 1017 1305 wave. I had bought this pen recorder 6 months ago. Wesley had a habit of making promises or giving directions verbally, then conveniently forgetting them later if they proved to be a bad idea. He'd say one thing in a private meeting, then claim he'd said the exact opposite in an email chain. It was a classic gaslighting technique used by weak managers to maintain plausible deniability. After he threw one of my shift supervisors under the bus for a scheduling error that was entirely his own fault, I decided I needed insurance. I never thought I would use it for something like this. I thought it was for protecting my team from his incompetence, not for documenting a federal crime. I clicked on the file, and Wesley's voice filled the small room, tinny but perfectly clear. "Keep it quiet, Gordon. It's better for everyone." Listening to it now, removed from the pressure of the moment, I could hear the arrogance in his tone, the casual dismissal of a catastrophic risk. He wasn't a monster. He was worse. He was a mediocre man given too much power, a man so insulated by his own ambition that human consequences were just abstract variables in a cost-benefit analysis. This recording was the heart of my plan, but it wasn't the whole of it. A single piece of evidence can be dismissed as a one-off, a moment of poor judgment. I needed to build a case. I needed to show a pattern of behavior, a culture of negligence that he had deliberately created. I needed context. I opened the file cabinet next to my desk. Inside was the thick folder I had been keeping for the past 2 years. My preventative maintenance reports, dozens of them, each one a neat, tidy testament to Wesley's reckless cost-cutting. Each report detailed a failure, the cost, the downtime, and my stark, repeated warning. It was a paper trail of his incompetence, written in my own hand, on official company letterhead, submitted through official channels. He couldn't claim he wasn't warned. I had warned him, in writing, over and over again. My plan began to crystallize. This wasn't going to be a simple wrongful termination suit that would be messy, protracted, and would ultimately come down to his word against mine. No, this was going to be bigger. This was going to be about safety, about corporate malfeasance, about a deliberate and systemic disregard for federal regulations. This wasn't a problem for a labor lawyer. This was a problem for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. But I couldn't just send them an anonymous tip. I needed more. I needed an inside source, someone who could corroborate my story and provide real-time information about what was happening on the floor now that I was gone. My thoughts immediately went to Maria Sanchez. I had hired her 10 years ago, straight out of the local community college's engineering tech program. She was bright, ambitious, and had a fierce sense of integrity. I had mentored her, promoted her, and over the years she had become my most trusted lead technician, my eyes and ears on the second shift. She was one of the few people I had told about the hairline fracture on line 4. She had been there when we inspected it, her face pale with the realization of what could have happened. She knew the poor performance story was a lie. She was my ally. I picked up my phone and sent her a short, encrypted text on an app we sometimes used for non-work communication. "Are you free for a private chat later?" Her reply came back in less than a minute. "Anything for you, Gordon. You know that. Call me after my shift." The final piece of my strategy was more of a long shot, a piece of hidden leverage I wasn't even sure I still had. About 5 years ago, before Wesley, OmniMech had been part of a regional industry-wide safety council. I was our representative. We would meet quarterly with other manufacturers and representatives from OSHA and the EPA to discuss best practices and new regulations. It was during one of these conferences that I met a man named Agent David Miller. He was a senior field investigator for OSHA, a lifer, a guy who had seen everything. He was sharp, no nonsense, and deeply committed to his work. We had hit it off. Spending a lunch break debating the finer points of safeguarding robotic arms, we found we shared a similar philosophy. Safety wasn't about compliance checklists. It was about creating a culture where every single employee felt empowered to stop the line. After the conference, we had exchanged contact information. We'd traded a few emails over the years, mostly just sharing interesting articles or case studies. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but I had his direct office number and his government email address. Going to the General OSHA hotline meant my complaint would go into a queue, triaged and assigned based on a bureaucratic formula. But going directly to Miller, a man I had a professional relationship with, a man whose judgment I trusted, that was different. I could frame the issue not just as a safety violation, but as a deliberate criminal act to defraud federal regulators, which I knew fell under the purview of the Department of Labor's Office of the Inspector General, a much more formidable entity. This wouldn't be a routine inspection. This would be a federal investigation. So there it was, my three-pronged attack, the smoking gun recording, the paper trail of documented negligence, and a direct line to a senior federal investigator. Wesley thought he was playing checkers, moving one of my pieces off the board. He had no idea I was about to tip over the whole table and start a new game of chess. That night, I barely slept. But it wasn't the anxious, worried sleeplessness of the day before. It was a different energy. It was the hum of a well-oiled machine, the focused intensity of a technician about to start a complex and critical job. I was building my case, brick by brick, laying a foundation of irrefutable fact. The next morning, I sat down at my desk with a fresh cup of coffee. I drafted a long, detailed email to Agent Miller. I didn't lead with the drama of being fired. I led with the facts. I outlined the technical specifics of the failure on line 4. I explained the catastrophic potential of a hydraulic flash fire. I attached the photos of the fractured manifold. I methodically described the pattern of budget cuts to preventative maintenance. I attached scanned copies of a dozen of my old reports, highlighting my repeated warnings. I described Wesley's cost-saving initiative with the new unvetted supplier. Only then, after establishing a clear and undeniable pattern of negligence, did I get to the heart of the matter. I described the meeting in his office, I transcribed the key parts of his order to me, and then I wrote the sentence that I knew would change everything. Agent Miller, I have an audio recording of this conversation. My supervisor, Wesley Thorne, on this date and time gave me a direct, illegal order to falsify a federal safety log to conceal this failure. 1 week after I refused this order, my employment of 25 years was terminated under the pretext of poor performance. I attached the audio file, encrypted and password protected. I wrote that I would provide the password over the phone. I concluded the email by stating my belief that this was not just a safety violation, but a criminal conspiracy to defraud the United States government and a violation of whistleblower protection laws. I signed it with my full name, my old title, and my personal phone number. I took a deep breath, and I hit send. The first move had been made. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the silence at OmniMech to be broken by the sound of federal agents knocking on the door. The first few days were unnervingly quiet. It was the calm before the storm, and I spent the time preparing for the fallout. I contacted a lawyer who specialized in whistleblower cases, a sharp woman named Eleanor Vance. I walked her through the entire situation, played her the recording, and showed her my mountain of documentation. Her eyes lit up. She said this was the cleanest case she'd seen in years. It wasn't just a he said, she said. It was a documented, recorded, and corroborated instance of corporate malfeasance. She began preparing the official whistleblower complaint and the wrongful termination suit that would follow. She advised me to not speak to anyone from OmniMech, to let all communication go through her. My call with Maria, my ally on the inside, was a lifeline to the world I had been cast out of. She was furious on my behalf, but also scared. "It's weird here now, Gordon," she'd said, her voice low over the phone. "Wesley is walking around like he won the lottery. He held a floor meeting and announced a new era of efficiency. He told everyone you'd chosen to retire and that he was promoting some kid from marketing, his nephew, I think, to be the new operations coordinator. The guy doesn't know the difference between a lathe and a ladder. Everyone is on edge. They know the story about you retiring is bull. They respect you, and they're scared of what happens now that you're not here to run interference." This was critical information. The narrative Wesley was spinning internally was weak and transparent. The promotion of his incompetent nephew was a classic move of an arrogant fool, further eroding any trust the team might have had in him. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it, and Wesley was in the process of losing the only real competence the plant had left, its experienced people. On the 4th day after I sent my email, my phone rang. The caller ID was a blocked number. I let it go to voicemail, just as Eleanor had instructed. A moment later, a notification popped up. It was Agent Miller. His message was brief and professional. "Mr. Gordon, David Miller here. I received your email and the attached materials. This is a very serious matter. My office will be taking immediate action. Do not speak to anyone at your former place of employment. We will be in touch shortly." The use of the phrase "my office" instead of "I" confirmed my suspicion. He had elevated it. This was no longer a simple inspection. It was a formal investigation. The very next morning, the storm broke. Maria called me, her voice a hushed, frantic whisper. She was hiding in a supply closet. "Gordon, they're here. They're really here. It's not just one guy in a polo shirt with a clipboard. It's a team, 4 of them in dark suits. They walked in with federal badges and went straight to the executive offices. They're with Wesley and Brendan from HR right now. They sealed the office. No one goes in or out. The whole plant is buzzing. What did you do?" I could almost feel the first tremor of panic shaking the foundations of Wesley's little kingdom. He was expecting, at worst, a routine safety audit weeks or months from now. He was prepared to smile, point to his spreadsheets, and talk about his new agile workflows. He was not prepared for a team of federal investigators from the Inspector General's office showing up unannounced on a Wednesday morning with a warrant to seize documents and computers. He thought he had committed a minor infraction in the privacy of his office. He was about to learn that ordering a federal crime, even in a whisper, is like screaming into a bullhorn. Later that afternoon, Maria called again. The atmosphere at the plant had shifted from nervous buzzing to outright panic. The investigators had emerged from Wesley's office and were now on the floor. They weren't just looking at machinery, they were conducting interviews. They were pulling line operators, technicians, and shift supervisors into conference rooms one by one, and they were asking very specific questions. They asked about the preventative maintenance budget cuts. They asked about the new parts supplier. They asked about the failure on line 4. And most tellingly, they asked everyone what Wesley had told them about my departure. "He's a ghost, Gordon," Maria said. "Wesley, he's pale. He keeps trying to interject when the investigators are talking to people, trying to provide context, and they just hold up a hand and tell him to return to his office. His authority has completely evaporated in the space of a few hours. Everyone sees it. He's been unmasked." The best part, Maria told me, was when the lead investigator, a tall, imposing man I assumed was Miller himself, asked to speak with Wesley's newly promoted nephew, the operations coordinator. The kid went into the conference room looking cocky and came out 20 minutes later looking like he was about to be sick. He couldn't answer a single technical question about the line he was supposedly coordinating. The investigators had exposed him as a fraud in front of half the management team. Wesley's panic began to manifest in predictable ways. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. It was Wesley. His voice was no longer calm and condescending. It was tight, strained, and laced with a barely concealed hysteria. "Gordon, it's Wesley. Listen, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding here, a breakdown in communication. These OSHA guys are running around making all sorts of wild accusations. I think you and I need to talk, to get our stories straight, for the good of the company. Call me back, as soon as possible. Get our stories straight," the classic plea of a guilty man who assumes everyone else is as corrupt as he is. He still thought this was something we could smooth over, a narrative we could spin together. He hadn't yet grasped the reality of his situation. I wasn't on his side. I was the one who had built the cage he was now trapped in. I forwarded the voicemail to my lawyer with a simple note: "He's getting desperate." The next day, the true takeover began. It wasn't silent at all. It was a cascade of failures. The investigators, armed with the information I had provided and now corroborated by dozens of interviews, placed a temporary shutdown order on line 4 and 2 other lines that used the faulty components. Production ground to a halt. The news of the federal investigation and the shutdown spread like wildfire. Our biggest aerospace client, the one Wesley was so desperate not to disappoint, got wind of it. Their head of procurement, a man I had worked with for a decade, called my personal cell phone. "Gordon, it's Mark from Apex Aerospace," he said. "I heard a crazy rumor that you retired, then I heard an even crazier rumor that there are feds crawling all over your old plant. What the hell is going on?" I stuck to the script Eleanor had given me. "Mark, it's good to hear your voice. I can't comment on the situation at OmniMech as there is an ongoing investigation. I can confirm that my employment was terminated last week. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. They fired you, he said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. The only guy over there who knew what he was doing? And now their lines are shut down for a safety issue? Okay, I think I'm starting to get the picture. He didn't need me to say another word. He was smart enough to connect the dots. An hour later, Maria texted me a photo of an internal memo that was circulating. Apex Aerospace had officially put a hold on all outstanding orders and was demanding a full independent audit of OmniMech's quality control systems, effective immediately. The silent foundation of trust I had built with that client over 10 years had just been leveraged into a multi-million-dollar sledgehammer, and it had landed squarely on Wesley's head. He hadn't just lost a manager, he had lost his company's most valuable asset, its credibility. The talent exodus began not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, individual decisions. It started with Maria. She called me the day after Apex put a hold on their orders. Her voice was firm, resolved. "I quit, Gordon," she said. "I went into HR this morning and gave my 2 weeks' notice. I can't work for these people. I can't work in a place where they'd rather risk lives than admit a mistake. My integrity isn't for sale." She told me that 2 of the other senior techs, the last of the old guard who had stayed on out of loyalty to me and the team, had put in their notice the same day. It was a chain reaction. Competence follows competence. The best people want to work with the best people. For years, I had been the anchor holding them there. Now that the anchor was gone, the ship was taking on water, and the most experienced sailors were jumping overboard. Wesley, in his infinite wisdom, had thought of me as a single expensive employee. He failed to understand that I was a force multiplier. My presence had retained other valuable employees. My departure, and the spectacular manner in which it happened, had become a catalyst for a mass resignation of the very people the company couldn't afford to lose. The institutional knowledge of OmniMech was walking out the door, one person at a time. Wesley's desperation escalated from panicked phone calls to outright threats. My lawyer, Eleanor, received a letter from OmniMech's corporate counsel. It was a blustering, aggressive cease and desist notice. It accused me of stealing proprietary information, of orchestrating a defamatory campaign against the company, and of tortious interference with their business contracts. It threatened me with a multi-million-dollar lawsuit if I didn't immediately retract my statements to OSHA. Eleanor just laughed when she read it to me over the phone. "This is beautiful, Gordon," she said. "This is the flailing of a drowning man. They have nothing. They're trying to intimidate you into silence because they know the evidence you have is irrefutable. This is an act of pure desperation." She drafted a response that was a masterclass in polite legal annihilation. It pointed out that my communications with a federal agency regarding a potential crime were legally protected under the Whistleblower Protection Act. It stated that any lawsuit of the nature they described would be met with a countersuit for malicious prosecution. And it ended with a simple, chilling sentence: "We look forward to seeing you in court, where my client's evidence, including the audio recording of Mr. Thorne, will be presented." They didn't respond. The threat of legal action vanished as quickly as it had appeared. They knew they had no move left on the board. All they could do was sit and wait for the consequences of their own actions to play out. The most pathetic attempt at counter-manipulation came a week into the investigation. My personal cell phone rang. It was an internal OmniMech number. I almost ignored it, but morbid curiosity got the better of me. I answered, but said nothing. "Gordon?" a voice said. It was Brenda, the HR manager who had sat silently while I was fired. Her voice was trembling. "Gordon, please, you have to stop this. People are going to lose their jobs. This whole company could go under. Is that what you want? To destroy the place you worked at for 25 years? It was a classic emotional manipulation tactic. Frame the whistleblower as the villain, the one destroying the company, rather than the corrupt management that had created the problem in the first place. But her plea had the opposite effect. I took a breath and finally spoke, my voice calm and even. "Brenda, I didn't do this. Wesley did this. He did this when he chose to cut corners on safety. He did this when he ordered me to commit a crime. And you did this when you sat there and said nothing. You all had a choice. You chose the lie. I chose my integrity. The consequences are your own. Don't ever call me again." I hung up the phone. There was no anger, no satisfaction, just a profound sense of pity. They still didn't get it. They thought this was about revenge. They couldn't comprehend that it was about something much simpler: accountability. Some people mistake silence for surrender, but they also mistake integrity for weakness. My refusal to be their accomplice wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of self-preservation, the preservation of the one thing they couldn't take from me, my own good name. The power had shifted completely. I was no longer the discarded employee. I was the architect of their downfall, and I had built it using only the materials they themselves had given me. The final confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown in a boardroom. It was a phone call 2 weeks after the investigators had first arrived. The caller ID showed OmniMech's main line. I was in my workshop, carefully reassembling the grandfather clock, the gentle ticking a soothing counterpoint to the chaos I knew was unfolding across town. I answered on speakerphone and continued my work. "Gordon?" The voice was weak, defeated. It was Wesley. "I'm listening," I said, my eyes focused on setting a tiny brass gear into place. There was a long pause filled with the sound of his ragged breathing. "They fired me," he whispered. "The board fired me this morning, citing gross negligence. They're bringing in a crisis management team. The federal prosecutor's office is filing charges for the cover-up against me personally." I didn't say anything. I just let the silence hang in the air. I nudged the gear a millimeter to the left. Perfect. "Why?" he finally asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this? You could have just walked away. You could have taken the severance and retired. Why burn the whole thing down?" I stopped my work and picked up the phone. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window at the clear blue sky. "You still don't get it, do you, Wesley?" I said, my voice quiet but clear. "You think this was about burning something down, but you're wrong. This was about building something up. It was about proving that integrity is worth more than a quarterly bonus. It was about proving that competence isn't just a line item on a budget. It's the only thing that actually matters." I paused, letting the words sink in. "You told me to keep it quiet," I continued, "because you thought it was better for everyone. But you were wrong. It wasn't better for the men and women on that floor whose lives you gambled with. It wasn't better for the people who might have been on that plane. It was only better for you. You didn't ask me to be quiet, Wesley. You asked me to be your accomplice. And my self-respect isn't for sale. Not at any price." I could hear him starting to blubber, to make excuses, to blame the pressure from corporate, to blame the new supplier. It was the pathetic final song of a man who had never once taken responsibility for his own actions. I didn't need to hear it. "Goodbye, Wesley," I said, and I ended the call. The news came out over the next few weeks. Wesley was indicted on federal charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy. The company OmniMech was fined millions by OSHA and entered into a consent decree that put them under strict federal oversight for the next 5 years. Their stock plummeted. Apex Aerospace and several other major clients permanently canceled their contracts. The company was a shell of its former self, a ghost ship sailing towards bankruptcy. My vindication wasn't in their failure, though. It was in what came next. My lawyer, Eleanor, secured a massive settlement for me from OmniMech's board, who were desperate to avoid a public wrongful termination trial on top of everything else. It was more than my lost pension, more than any severance they could have offered. It was a formal financial admission that they were wrong. But the real victory came from a different quarter. Maria and the 3 other senior techs who had quit came to me. We met at my house around the kitchen table. "Gordon," Maria said, acting as the spokesperson, "we don't know what you're planning on doing next, but whatever it is, we want in. We trust you. We want to work in a place where doing the right thing is the right thing to do." And that's how my new life started. We pooled our resources and our expertise, and we started a small consulting firm, Sanchez Gordon Precision Solutions. We don't manufacture parts, we fix companies. We go into manufacturing plants that are struggling with safety and efficiency, and we teach them how to build a culture of competence from the ground up. We teach them that the person with the most valuable information isn't always the one in the corner office. It's usually the person on the factory floor with grease under their fingernails. Our first client was a mid-sized competitor of OmniMech. They had heard what happened and wanted to make sure their own house was in order. 6 months later, we got a call from Mark at Apex Aerospace. He wanted to hire us to audit their entire supply chain. We were in business, real business. My new workplace isn't a sprawling factory floor. It's a small, clean office with 4 desks, a big whiteboard, and a coffee maker that's always on. I'm working with people I respect, doing work I believe in. I'm building something new instead of just trying to keep something old from falling apart. I look around at my team, at Maria and the others, and I see the future. They are the new generation, armed with my experience and their own fierce integrity. I haven't just been vindicated, I've been renewed. Every now and then I'll drive past the old OmniMech plant. There's a for lease sign out front now. The parking lot is empty. The silence there is different from the silence in my truck that day. It's not a heavy, oppressive silence. It's just empty. A hollow space where a great company used to be, before it was gutted from the inside by arrogance and greed. It's a monument to a simple, powerful truth. You can't build a future on a foundation of lies. So here I am. My name is Gordon. I'm not Gordon from OmniMech anymore. I'm just Gordon. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like more than enough. I learned a hard lesson. Loyalty to a company is meaningless if that company isn't loyal to its own principles. Your true assets are your skills, your experience, and your character. Don't ever let a manager with a fancy degree and a cheap soul convince you otherwise. Many of you watching have probably faced your own Wesley. You've been overlooked, underestimated, or told to compromise your principles for the sake of a spreadsheet. You've been made to feel that your experience is a liability, not an asset. My story is for you. It's a reminder that competence is real, integrity is real, and in the long run, they are the only things that have any true value. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to be quiet. Sometimes you have to be willing to burn down the old rotten structure to make way for something new and clean to be built in its place. They thought that would be the end of it, but for me it was just the beginning. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it. And make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. Let me know your own experiences in the comments below. I'll be reading them.